Okay, this topic is about knowledge and specifically the definition of knowledge. There's going to be a number of kinds of knowledge that we have a look at, and we're going to focus mainly on what philosophers call propositional knowledge. So we'll see how that gets defined. You see the initial definition on this slide of knowledge as justified true belief. And that's going to be the definition that we try and unpack and focus on to start off with at the start of this topic. So let's have a look at that. So I've structured this topic around a few questions. These are drawn from the initial syllabus points. So the questions are as follows. So we're looking initially at the three types of knowledge that philosophers often talk about. Secondly, at a contemporary philosopher called Linda Zagzebski, whose name I'm sure I will mispronounce at some point here, and how she approaches defining knowledge, and the tripartite definition of knowledge, or three-part definition of knowledge. That's what we're going to focus on in this initial part here. Moving on, later on we'll see something from Edmund Gettier and his famous objection to this definition of knowledge, as well as various responses to this. The kind of big essay question you might get on this area is whether knowledge is defined properly as justified true belief. So here's a few questions just to have a think about then. Why would anyone care what the definition of knowledge really is? Well, I think for a number of reasons, and particularly these days where we're often talked about as living in a knowledge economy, we might want to think about what exactly it means to know something in that way, and where the kind of boundaries and divisions are between different kinds of knowledge and how that might be helpful for us. So perhaps have a think about, what's your ideal job? What are you looking to do with your life? And what kind of knowledge is that going to involve? At the moment, I think one of the competing kind of areas here is going to be around artificial intelligence. And, you might think, well, could the sort of knowledge you might have as a human being be different or better in some way than that of an artificially intelligent robot or machine? Could that do your ideal job better? What would you know perhaps in this ideal job that an AI robot would not? And why do you think that AI has learned to beat humans at most complex games, things like chess or the ancient Chinese game of Go, but until very recently always struggled with poker? Those are some of the things that you might want to think about in this context here. Here's just one example, law. So this is a famous recent example where the artificial intelligence beat human lawyers at a particular experiment. So as I've said just briefly on the slide here, so the participants were given 4 hours to work out the legal issues in 5 standard kind of legal agreements, non-disclosure agreements. What they found was, in the end, the neural network, the artificial intelligence program, achieved an average of 94% accuracy compared to the lawyer's average of 85%. But this is the big deal, and if you think about lawyers charging by the hour, while it took the humans anywhere from 51 minutes to more than 2.5 hours to complete all 5 agreements, the artificial intelligence finished in 26 seconds. So what could a lawyer offer that an artificial intelligence couldn't? Okay, so that takes us on initially to the 3 types of knowledge here. Roughly, the first is ability or practical knowledge, so knowing how to do something, so how to ride a bike or tie your shoelaces, where you can perform a task but might not be able to put it into words particularly. It's actually quite difficult to describe to someone how to tie their shoelaces, but it's fairly straightforward for us all to do. Secondly, something called acquaintance knowledge. So knowledge of something, where you have perhaps direct experience of a sensation or a place or a person. For example, you might know the smell of a rose, and you know that by direct experience, but again might be quite difficult to put into words. You have to be acquainted with it. You have to have had that experience in order to know what it is. Finally, the one that we're mostly going to focus on, which is propositional knowledge. So propositional knowledge is knowing that something is the case, where you make a claim about the world. For example, Paris is the capital of France. This is a statement of what is the case. It can be put into words, and it asserts something. Usually if you have a belief, you are asserting something about the world, and that's something which has truth value. It can be true or it can be false. It might match up to the facts or it might not. So those are your three broad types of knowledge: knowing how, ability knowledge; knowing of, acquaintance knowledge; and knowing that, which is propositional knowledge. So this takes us on then to the definition of knowledge, and what we're doing when we're kind of defining propositional knowledge in particular, and to the contemporary philosopher writing at the moment called Linda Zagzebski, and she gives a kind of guide and a breakdown, drawing on various other philosophers, particularly on Locke, on what a good or proper kind of philosophical definition should do. And we're going to spend a couple of minutes just having a look at what she says. So this debate then, as I've said, is over how to properly define propositional knowledge. After all, lots of things look like knowledge, but on reflection we might not think that they are, and this is what a lot of this topic will be about, is about distinguishing those cases which seem like knowledge from cases which actually really aren't knowledge. So this goes back to Plato, and he gives a number of examples. One of them that I've mentioned here is the example of a jury reaching a correct verdict about somebody on trial, but they're guided in their judgment by hearsay and gossip. Now, they do get the right decision, but did they have knowledge? You might think about, if a jury is, I don't know, say racist, if they convict somebody based on their race, and it turns out the person was guilty, did they know the person was guilty or not? And Plato wants to say, well, probably not. There's something importantly different here about knowledge from things that perhaps come close to knowledge and perhaps even are true. So this gets us into what we're looking at doing when we're offering a philosophical definition, and that's how we're going to proceed. So Zagzebski wants to try and say, okay, so definitions work in the sort of following kind of way, and that some things are capable of what she calls real definitions, in that they get to an objective essence of the thing defined, whereas some things don't really have such a real or objective essence. And when I say objective here, I mean something that's true for everyone, not just a person's opinion or something that changes from one day to the next. It's something which is really, really essential. So, for example, one of the things she talks about is something like weeds isn't something which has an objective biological definition or essence. It changes according to culture and preference, whereas something like water does have a real definition. It has an essence, that's H2O. That does have a real definition. Sometimes philosophers talk about these things with real essences or definitions as a natural kind term, something which really has this objective underlying essence that we can pin down. So Zagzebski builds on this in a couple of ways. She talks about the way that we define things sometimes as a practical affair, something that we might, class a tool, for example, as if it helps us perform a certain job. It's something which is about how it's used, and that's the sort of central feature of that kind of definition. Whereas sometimes we look at rigorously defining something in theoretical terms, where we aim to pin down its nature and get to its essence. So this is often what scientists are trying to do. They're not looking for some sort of changeable definition of something for a practical purpose. They're looking for the real essence of something that they can pin down and say is true for everyone all the time. Now, this kind of thing can also apply to philosophical terms, according to Zagzebski. And what she wants to do is to try and aim for, although it might not be 100% successful, aim for a theoretical definition of the term, in this case, knowledge. Okay, so your kind of big essay questions here are going to ask you usually something like, is knowledge best defined as a justified true belief? Something along those lines. They're looking for you to evaluate a particular definition of knowledge, and this is often what philosophers are doing if they're trying to pin down perhaps concepts like justice or beauty or truth. They're trying to kind of offer a reasonable, believable, rigorous definition. Now, Zagzebski uses this approach when she's looking at the definition of knowledge, and she gives us some, I think, helpful rules, some of which we've already mentioned in other topics, for how to define knowledge. So these are things that you could perhaps set out at the start of an essay on this, and you could say, okay, this is what good definitions should avoid, particularly to be properly rigorous in terms of a theoretical definition. So it should not do the following things. So this is what we want to avoid when we're trying to pin down our definition of knowledge. We want to avoid, firstly, being what's referred to as ad hoc, in other words, improvised to meet a particular problem or objection. So you might have a kind of objection given to your theory of knowledge and just try and sort of make up a definition just to meet that one objection. Now, that's not very good, because that's just improvised kind of on the hoof. It's not really being rigorous and universally applicable. So it shouldn't be just kind of improvised to meet a very particular or specific problem. It should be something which is universal and rigorous. Secondly, it shouldn't be negative. It shouldn't be defined by what it is not. So trying to sort of define maybe something like God as something that exists not within time. It shouldn't be defined by what it's not like. It should be defined by what it really is. That's more helpful, according to Zagzebski. Fairly straightforwardly, it shouldn't be too obscure. It shouldn't be too overcomplicated. What we're trying to do is to clarify and pin down something. We shouldn't throw in lots of terms which are confusing or need themselves to be defined as well. Finally, something that we've looked at a couple of times, the definition shouldn't be circular. In other words, it shouldn't assume what it is supposed to explain. It shouldn't be kind of smuggling in what it's actually trying to clarify. So those are the four things that definitions should avoid in order to be good definitions. And when we look at examples later on this, we'll see how that plays out. So that takes us then to the tripartite definition of knowledge, the big centerpiece of this whole debate, and it goes back to that example partly that I gave with Plato and what he was talking about with the jury. The tripartite definition just means then three parts. And the idea here is that in order to have knowledge, you must have three things or conditions in place. The conditions are something that has to be met for something to be what it is we're talking about, in this case, knowledge. So traditionally, it's thought then that knowledge has three parts. The first part being belief. So you must believe that something is the case, the belief condition. For example, Sharon believes that Paris is the capital of France. Secondly, the belief must be true. So the truth condition, for example, the fact that Paris is, in fact, the capital of France. Now, it's not enough just for those two things to be there to have knowledge. Because remember, in the case of the jury, they believed that the person was guilty, and in fact it was true that the person was guilty. But if they didn't have this last condition, then that's not genuine knowledge, according to the tripartite definition. So the last point here is that you have to have adequate evidence or justification for believing the thing that you believe here. So that's the justification or evidence condition. For example, perhaps Sharon has read that Paris is the capital of France in a trustworthy geography textbook. So there are three things that you need in order to have knowledge, and then if we have all of those three things, the idea is that is a case of knowledge. The technical way that we'll get into putting this is that these conditions are called individually necessary. They each have to be there, and they are jointly sufficient for knowledge. So taken together, if you've got all three together, you automatically have knowledge. So belief, truth, justification. If we talk about the tripartite definition of knowledge, that's the explanation that you need to give. You could flip this around, if that doesn't make a lot of sense so far, and just think, well, you know, if you take one of these away, you wouldn't genuinely have knowledge. It seems strange to say that you would know that, I don't know, Paris is the capital of France, but you don't believe it. So that's why belief has to be there. Likewise, you would say that something is true in order to be known. You can't know something false. I cannot know that I am Barack Obama if I am not clearly Barack Obama. You have to have truth in order to have knowledge. So belief, truth, and justification are all necessary. They're all required to have knowledge. So just to emphasize that last condition, because that's the key one for us, and that's the one the debate will largely revolve around. When we looked at the three different conditions, belief, truth, and justification, it's the last one that is most often discussed in this debate here. So the key one for our debate is the justification condition. So thinking back to Plato's jury, they got the correct verdict based on hearsay. They had a true belief, but they did not know he was guilty. Why not? Well, because their belief was not properly justified. And this really is the key point for this whole topic. And this is this intuitive belief that knowledge is different to a lucky truth. You cannot simply stumble across knowledge. You can't just get lucky and stumble across the truth and then know the thing. The idea of this whole debate is that knowledge has some sort of reason, not justification, some sort of link between the belief and the truth, some sort of justification of why something is the case, which is solid and sound, not just like the jury hearsay or perhaps racism. It has to be grounded properly in order to be knowledge. Okay, so this takes us to the kind of technical way of talking about this definition. I've talked about conditions. I've mentioned the necessary and sufficient terms a little bit in a previous slide. This is the breakdown of what that means. This is fairly difficult, so don't worry if it takes a bit to kind of get your head around this, and we'll discuss this as we kind of go through the rest of the topic and try and clarify. So I'll give the technical definition, and then I'll give a sort of hopefully more down-to-earth, straightforward definition, and then we can look at it in the context of a couple of examples. So a necessary condition in the technical way of defining it for some state of affairs S is a condition that must be satisfied in order for S to obtain. So what does that mean? Well, some state of affairs S in our example here is knowledge. What do you have to have knowledge? So it's something in ordinary language that you need to have the thing in question. You can't have the thing without it. A sufficient condition, on the other hand, for some state of affairs S is a condition that, if satisfied, guarantees that S obtains. So again, what does this mean? Well, the state of affairs, remember, is knowledge. What is it that would guarantee that we have knowledge? What state of affairs guarantees that we have that thing? In other words, when you have it, the sufficient condition or set of conditions that are sufficient, it automatically makes the thing in question. So remember when I mentioned the tripartite definition before, I said that truth, belief, and justification were individually necessary. You have to have all three things. And then taken together, they are supposed to be jointly sufficient. So we can't have knowledge, according to the traditional definition, without one of those three things, knowledge being justified true belief. If you take any one of those away, you don't have knowledge. But if we have all three together, we automatically have cases of knowledge. That's the theory behind the tripartite definition of knowledge. Okay, so let's have a look at a couple of examples. There's a number of them in the booklet. I've just tried to pick out a couple of hopefully relatively straightforward ones. And I've given the reminder of the sort of straightforward definitions on each of these slides, just so we see how this works. So having grandchildren and being a grandmother, the question here is having grandchildren necessary, sufficient, both, or neither to be a grandmother? So hopefully you've had to work through these examples and how to think about them yourselves. I'm just going to kind of break down why these are the answers that I think are appropriate here. This would be necessary but not sufficient. Okay, so necessary, remember, something you need to have the thing in question. You can't have the thing without it. Sufficient, when you have it, it automatically makes the thing in question. So why is this necessary but not sufficient? Well, because in order to be a grandmother, you need grandchildren. You cannot be a grandmother without at one point having had grandchildren. So that does not automatically, however, make you a grandmother, because you could have grandchildren and be a grandfather. So it's not sufficient because you're not automatically a grandmother. If you have grandchildren, you could be a grandfather. So necessary because you can't have the thing without it, but not sufficient because you need something else to be a grandmother. Okay, another example. So going to college to take your A levels and being a student. So is it necessary, sufficient, both, or neither, going to college in order to be a student? In this case, sufficient, but not necessary. So again, why is this? Well, remember, sufficient is where you have something that automatically makes something the case. So if you go to college and you take your A levels, you are a student. That's automatically going to be the case. But it's not necessary because you could be a student in other ways. So why is it sufficient but not necessary? Because taking your A levels at college automatically makes you a student, but it's not necessary as there are other ways to be a student. You could be doing a degree and not A levels. You could be doing your GCSEs. So sufficient but not necessary here. Final example for now. So being, and I've expanded this here a little bit, being a two-dimensional geometric shape with only three sides and internal angles adding up to 180 degrees. Are those conditions necessary, sufficient, both, or neither to be a triangle? Well, in this case, I would say necessary and sufficient. So why is this the case? Because the conditions automatically make a triangle. They are sufficient in order to make something a triangle, and they're necessary because if you take any of them away, potentially you don't have a triangle. It would be something else other than a triangle. So you need the things there, which makes them necessary conditions, and they are sufficient because taken together they automatically give you the thing in question. So there are other examples to discuss. As I said, this is a tricky set of concepts to get your head around, but they are super, super useful. I think not just in philosophy, but in law, in science, in history. This idea of necessary and sufficient conditions is super useful for analysing things. Just as an example, I used to teach history. If you think about the causes of the Russian Revolution in 1917, the October Revolution, then you might say, okay, well, there was a number of things that were necessary. You had to have the First World War, you had to have conditions of extreme poverty and underdevelopment perhaps across the country, but also you had to have the leadership of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. So perhaps some of those things were necessary, but it was only sufficient if they're all taken together. Perhaps you wouldn't have had a revolution without one of those things. Okay, so what have we had a look at here? Well, we've had a look at the three types of knowledge then. So ability knowledge, knowing how, acquaintance knowledge of something being the case, and then propositional knowledge, knowledge that something is the case, and that's the one we're focusing on. We looked a bit at Zagzebski and her reasons for saying that good definitions of knowledge will be following certain rules. They won't be ad hoc, they won't be obscure. We looked at the tripartite definition of knowledge as the main focus here, where we're breaking down knowledge into its three component parts, the justification, truth, and belief conditions. And then we've tried to look at what that means in terms of this individually necessary and jointly sufficient term. So this is all stuff that we're going to kind of unpack and then analyze as we go through this topic. But that's the kind of introduction to what we're doing when we're trying to define what is knowledge.